Picture this: the last flicker of torchlight casts long shadows across the stone walls of a fortress that has stood for centuries. Outside, the enemy's war drums echo like thunder, their numbers stretching beyond the horizon. Inside, the defenders know the truth. There will be no reinforcements, no miracle, no escape. Yet in that moment, something extraordinary happens. Instead of laying down their arms, they choose to fight not for victory, but for something far greater. This is the untold story of history's most defiant last stands, where doomed fortresses refused to fade quietly into the night. These weren't just battles, they were acts of sheer will, where courage eclipsed logic, and the human spirit burned brightest in the face of annihilation. What drives men and women to stand against impossible odds? It's more than desperation, it's a calculated defiance, a refusal to let their story end on someone else's terms. Throughout the medieval world, from the windswept castles of Europe to the sun-baked strongholds of the Middle East, besieged defenders turned certain defeat into legendary resistance. They used every tool at their disposal: cunning deception, psychological warfare, even the architecture of their own fortresses to stage counterattacks that stunned their enemies. These weren't reckless charges but deliberate, often brilliant acts of defiance meant to carve their names into history, even as the walls crumbled around them. Today, we're stepping into their world. We'll uncover the strategies that turned desperation into spectacle, the mindsets that transformed hopelessness into unshakable resolve. How did a handful of starving defenders rally for one final, devastating strike? What tricks did they use to make their enemies believe they still held the upper hand? And why do these stories, centuries later, still send chills down our spines? The answers lie in the grit, ingenuity, and raw defiance of those who stared down the abyss and chose to fight back. This isn't just a tale of war, it's a testament to the unyielding human spirit. So prepare to witness history's most audacious last gasps, where even in death, the defeated refused to be forgotten. A doomed fortress wasn't just a structure on the verge of falling. It was a ticking clock, a place where time itself seemed to thicken with dread. Picture the scene: food stores dwindling to scraps, the last barrels of fresh water rationed drop by drop, and the once impenetrable walls now cracked like old bones under the relentless hammer of siege engines. Outside, an enemy host stretched farther than the eye could see, their banners fluttering like a forest set aflame. Yet inside, something remarkable stirred. Even as hope faded, defiance took root. Geography often played a cruel hand in these final acts. A castle perched on a cliff might buy its defenders time, but also trapped them with no retreat. A citadel surrounded by marshlands could delay attackers until the winter frost hardened the ground, turning wetlands into highways for invasion. But it wasn't just physical barriers that sealed a fortress's fate. Morale was the invisible thread holding everything together. When supplies ran low, it wasn't hunger that broke men first. It was the gnawing fear that no one was coming to save them. Yet in the darkest hours, leadership could ignite a spark where none should have existed. A single commander's unshaken resolve, a rallying cry delivered at the right moment, could turn despair into something sharper, a collective refusal to die quietly. And then there were the defenses, or what remained of them. Broken gates, collapsed tunnels, towers reduced to rubble. To an outsider, it might have looked like madness to keep fighting. But to those inside, every shattered wall became a new opportunity. A gap in the stones, a killing ground for ambush, a collapsed corridor, a funnel to lure enemies into a trap. These defenders weren't just holding ground, they were rewriting the rules of surrender. Why charge blindly into death when you could orchestrate a final, devastating blow, one that would etch your name into legend even as the stones fell around you? The true genius of these last stands lay in their unpredictability. An enemy expecting surrender would instead face a sudden sally, a rain of firepots dropped from crumbling battlements, or even a staged retreat that masked a deadly counterstroke. These weren't acts of blind fury, they were calculated, almost artistic in their brutality, and that's what made them unforgettable. Long after the fortress fell, the stories would survive, of the defenders who looked annihilation in the eye and laughed. When the walls began to crack and the enemy's shouts grew louder, the defenders of a doomed fortress reached for a weapon far older than steel, the human mind. Psychological warfare wasn't just a tactic, it was the last spark of control in a hopeless situation. Imagine the scene, a garrison down to its final handful of fighters, outnumbered 100 to 1, yet still dictating the rhythm of the siege. How, by turning their weakness into a weapon, they lit bonfires along empty stretches of the walls at night, creating the illusion of a bustling, well-manned defense. They staged raucous feasts within earshot of the enemy, clinking cups and cheering as if celebrating a victory that hadn't happened. To the besiegers peering through the gloom, it didn't matter if the sounds were real. Doubt crept in like fog. Were these defenders laughing because they knew something the attackers didn't? Rumors became as lethal as arrows. A whispered tale of an underground river supplying the fortress, or a hidden tunnel leading to the enemy's rear, could paralyze an entire army with caution. Commanders who should have been preparing for assault instead wasted days probing for traps that didn't exist. Even the simplest tricks carried weight. A lone defender might appear on the battlements at dawn, polishing his helmet with exaggerated care, as if expecting reinforcements by noon. The message was clear: we're not acting like men who have lost. And in that uncertainty, the attackers' momentum stalled. But the most brilliant deceptions played on the enemy's own fears. At the siege of Château-Gaillard in the early 13th century, French defenders reportedly hurled beehives into the tunnels English sappers had dug beneath the walls. The chaos that followed wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Suddenly, every shadowy passage seemed like a potential death trap. Elsewhere, defenders staged mock executions of their own men in view of the enemy, only for those corpses to slip back inside once night fell. The besiegers woke to the same faces on the walls, sowing whispers of witchcraft or divine intervention. What made these tactics so devastating was their timing. A fortress on the brink of collapse had nothing left to lose, which meant every act of deception was bolder, more unpredictable than the last. The defenders weren't just buying time, they were rewriting the story of their own demise. And sometimes, just sometimes, that story ended not with a whimper, but with a final, furious counterblow that left the victors nursing wounds no bandage could cover. Because in the end, the goal wasn't to survive. It was to make sure the enemy remembered long after the last stone had fallen, that taking this fortress cost them far more than they ever imagined. History remembers the commanders of doomed fortresses not for their victories, but for their ability to turn despair into defiance. Take Baldwin of Ibelin during the fall of Jerusalem in the 12th century. His garrison was starving, his walls breached, yet he refused to let his men die as victims. Instead, he staged a midnight sortie dressed in the captured armor of a Saracen emir, leading his knights straight into the heart of the enemy camp. It wasn't just a raid, it was theater. By dawn, rumors spread that a vengeful ghost knight haunted the siege lines, and Baldwin's exhausted men fought harder, believing their leader could bend fate itself. William Marshall, the legendary knight who defended Chinon Castle against overwhelming odds, understood something deeper about leadership. it wasn't enough to be brave. You had to make bravery contagious. When his walls crumbled and his archers ran out of arrows, he didn't rally his men with speeches about honor. Instead, he climbed onto the broken battlements alone, polishing his sword in full view of the enemy. The message was unmistakable. If I'm not afraid, why should you be? By morning, every surviving defender stood beside him, not because they thought they'd win, but because they refused to let their commander face the end alone. These leaders mastered the art of turning their own mortality into a weapon. At the siege of Antioch, Bohemond of Taranto ordered his men to burn their last grain stores in plain sight of the enemy, then staged a mock feast with empty plates. To the besiegers, it looked like madness, until Bohemond's forces erupted from the gates the next morning, fueled by the desperate energy of men with nothing left to lose. The attackers, expecting weakened stragglers, instead faced a hurricane of rage. The greatest trick these commanders pulled wasn't just inspiring their men to fight, it was convincing the enemy that surrender was never an option. When Saladin's forces surrounded Kerak Castle, its elderly lord, Reynold of Chatillon, didn't barricade himself inside. He ordered the gates welded shut behind him as he led a cavalry charge directly at Saladin's tent. He died within minutes, but the spectacle forced Saladin to spend days reinforcing his own camp instead of pressing the assault. Reynold's defiance bought Kerak 2 extra weeks of life and turned a military defeat into a legend that still echoes across the deserts of Jordan. What separated these leaders from ordinary commanders wasn't tactics but psychology. They understood that in the final hours of a siege, facts didn't matter, perception did. A well-timed laugh in the face of death could unnerve an enemy more than 1,000 arrows. A lone figure standing calmly on a crumbling tower became a symbol no battering ram could topple. These men didn't just command soldiers, they authored the last defiant sentence of their fortress's story and made sure it was written in fire. Suicidal sorties defied every instinct of a besieged defender. Why throw open the gates when the only certainty was death? Because sometimes the mathematics of desperation demanded it. Picture a fortress with days left before starvation, its walls groaning under the weight of relentless battering rams. Staying inside meant slow suffocation under collapsing stone, but a sudden, violent strike outward that could rewrite the equation entirely. At Château-Gaillard in 1204, French defenders didn't just wait for the English to breach their walls, they flooded out in a midnight raid, torching siege towers that had taken weeks to build. The attackers lost not just machinery but time, and in siege warfare, time was the currency of survival. These weren't blind charges, they were precision strikes aimed at the enemy's nervous system. A well-timed sortie could assassinate engineers who knew how to dismantle walls or scatter the laborers hauling ammunition. At the Siege of Malta in 1565, the Knights Hospitaller launched repeated small-scale attacks solely to destroy Ottoman gunpowder stores. Each barrel lost meant another day the fortress stood, but the true genius lay in targeting morale. When defenders of Stirling Castle in 1304 rode out to slaughter the English camp's cooks and stable hands, it wasn't just about killing, it was about proving nowhere was safe. An army that couldn't sleep, eat, or tend its horses soon lost its will to fight. Then there was the dark art of leader hunting. At Antioch in 1098, Bohemond's men learned the Turkish commander Kerbog had always prayed at dawn on a hilltop near the camp. A suicidal charge through enemy lines wasn't just bravery, it was a sniper's calculation. When Kerbog fell, his army unraveled within hours. The lesson was clear: a single well-placed strike could do what months of defense could not. Yet the cruelest irony of these sorties, their success often hastened the fortress's fall. A garrison that spent its last strength on a glorious attack had nothing left for the final assault. But that was the point. These men weren't fighting to live, they were fighting to choose how they died. And in that choice, they turned their inevitable defeat into something the victors would never forget. The most audacious move a desperate fortress could attempt wasn't breaking the siege, it was breaking the enemy's will to fight by removing the head of the snake. Imagine the gamble, infiltrating an enemy camp swarming with thousands, all for a single, lethal strike at the one man holding the entire army together. At the siege of Thessalonica in the 14th century, Byzantine defenders came within a hair's breadth of pulling it off. A team of volunteers disguised as deserters slipped into the Ottoman camp, their daggers hidden beneath ragged cloaks. They nearly reached the Sultan's tent before a suspicious guard raised the alarm. The attempt failed, but the shockwaves rippled through the Ottoman ranks for days. Commanders slept in armor, changed locations hourly, and second-guessed every shadow. The siege continued, but the psychological damage was done. The invincible conquerors suddenly felt vulnerable. These decapitation strikes weren't just acts of desperation, they were masterclasses in asymmetric warfare. Success required more than bravery, it demanded insider knowledge. Spies within the enemy camp could reveal a commander's routines, where he took his meals, which guards were lax, even the layout of his private quarters. At the siege of Edessa in the 12th century, Armenian defenders bribed a disgruntled servant in the Zengid camp to poison Emir Zangi's wine. The plot was uncovered, but the emir's subsequent paranoia slowed his army's advance for weeks. Other attempts relied on sheer theatrical audacity. During the Mongol siege of Kiev, a Kievan knight allegedly disguised himself as a Tatar messenger, riding straight into Batu Khan's command tent with a concealed blade. He missed his target but left the Mongols so rattled they postponed their final assault to purge their ranks of potential infiltrators. The aftermath of a failed attempt could be horrific: mass executions, tightened security, brutal reprisals against civilians. Yet for defenders with no future to lose, the calculus was chillingly simple. Even a botched strike sowed distrust among enemy officers, delayed attacks as security protocols multiplied, and sometimes sparked power struggles between ambitious subordinates. At Harfleur in 1415, a failed assassination of Henry V backfired spectacularly, but the ensuing witch hunt for conspirators divided his council and delayed the march to Agincourt. Time became the silent ally of those under siege. Every hour the enemy spent looking over their shoulders was an hour the defenders could patch a wall, dig a tunnel, or wait for rains to flood the besiegers' trenches. The real victory wasn't always killing the commander, it was forcing him to waste precious days reacting instead of acting, and in the end, that's what made these strikes so terrifying to the attackers. They weren't just fighting soldiers, they were fighting men who had already made peace with death and now fought solely to dictate the terms of their legacy. When survival was impossible, the greatest weapon a fortress could wield was time itself. Not hours or days, but the agonizing stretch of moments that turned a swift conquest into a grinding nightmare for the besiegers. Consider the siege of Malta in 1565, where the Knights Hospitaller knew their tiny island couldn't withstand the Ottoman onslaught forever. So they weaponized delay. They poisoned wells with dead livestock, forcing the enemy to ration every sip of water. They burned their own crops rather than let them feed the invaders, turning the landscape into a smoldering wasteland. Each act of self-destruction wasn't surrender, it was a clock ticking louder in the enemy's ears. Scorched earth tactics became an art form in these final hours. At the siege of Rhodes a century earlier, defenders filled tunnels beneath the walls with burning sulfur and pitch, not to stop the enemy, but to force them to dig new ones from scratch. Every delayed assault meant another sunrise where relief might crest the horizon. even negotiations became a weapon. Commanders like Vlad the Impaler famously dragged out peace talks while their men repaired breaches under cover of darkness. A truce flag wasn't white, it was a smokescreen. Faith often became the invisible fortress within the fortress. When physical walls crumbled, belief held men upright. At Jerusalem's fall in 1087, defenders clustered in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, not just for refuge, but because its stones whispered of something greater than mortal victory. They fought not for the city's survival, but for the idea that their sacrifice would echo in eternity. The same fervor ignited the Teutonic Knights at Marienburg in 1456, who turned their chapel into a command post, weaving prayers into battle plans. To outsiders, it looked like delusion. To those inside, it was the only logic left. If death was certain, why not make it sacred? This was the cruel calculus of delay. A garrison buying time wasn't just preserving lives. It was rewriting the arithmetic of legacy. Every scorched field, every poisoned well, every hour stolen from the enemy's advance meant one less verse in the victor's song and one more in the ballad of the defiant. The true measure of these last stands wasn't in ground held, but in the scars they left on history's skin. Long after the banners fell, the world would remember not how quickly they were conquered, but how fiercely they made the conquerors bleed for every inch. When the walls shook and the night seemed endless, faith became the last unbreakable fortress, one no battering ram could breach. Across the medieval world, defenders turned to divine intervention not just for comfort, but as a tactical weapon. The Teutonic Knights at the siege of Marienburg didn't merely pray for salvation. They marched into battle clutching relics. Their swords, anointed by priests who promised martyrdom, meant immediate ascension to heaven. To these men, death wasn't a threat, it was a reward waiting to be claimed. Their enemies soon learned a chilling truth. An army that welcomes slaughter is far more dangerous than one fighting to survive. Yet religious fervor could cut both ways. The Children's Crusade of 1212 revealed the dark edge of blind faith. Thousands of young believers, convinced God would part the seas or crumble Muslim walls with divine breath, marched unarmed toward certain doom. Their tragic end exposed the fine line between courage and delusion, but even in failure, their story haunted Europe, because faith, when harnessed correctly, didn't just inspire, it multiplied strength. At the siege of Antioch during the First Crusade, starving defenders claimed to unearth the Holy Lance, the very spear that pierced Christ's side. Whether divine providence or clever propaganda, the effect was undeniable. Men who'd been on the verge of surrender now fought like avenging angels, routing an enemy 4 times their size. Could miracles alone break a siege? Rarely, but paired with ingenuity, they became unstoppable. Consider the defenders of Constantinople in 1453, who processed the Virgin Mary's icon along the crumbling Theodosian walls as Ottoman cannons roared. To the invaders, it seemed like desperation. To the Byzantines, it was psychological warfare, forcing maimed superstitious troops to question whether heaven itself fought against them. Elsewhere, Spanish defenders during the Reconquista painted crosses on their shields with lime, knowing the sight would unsettle Moorish soldiers who remembered tales of Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moorslayer charging across battlefields in a blaze of holy light. The true power of faith lay in its ability to rewrite reality. A garrison singing hymns as fire rained down wasn't just preparing for death, it was broadcasting unshakable resolve. When Saladin's forces heard crusaders chanting psalms before a suicidal charge at Hattin, even his veteran emirs hesitated. Because how do you defeat an enemy that believes, truly believes, their God has already written the ending? That's why the greatest siege commanders didn't dismiss religion as mere superstition. They feared it because a man who thinks he's enacting divine will doesn't retreat. He doesn't negotiate, and most terrifying of all, he doesn't count the cost. When the last arrow had flown and the final crossbow bolt lay spent, defenders of doomed fortresses reached for anything that could hurt, hinder, or horrify. Every mundane object became a potential weapon, not by design, but by desperation refined to brilliance. Picture the scene at Harlech Castle during its grueling siege in the 15th century. Welsh rebels, cut off from supplies, turned their kitchens into an armory. Cauldrons meant for stew bubbled with rancid fat and quicklime, a concoction that burned through armor and flesh alike. Grinding stones from the mill, once used to crush grain, now plummeted from battlements to shatter skulls below. Even the castle's beehives, symbols of peaceful industry, became projectiles hurled into enemy formations, their furious swarms disrupting assaults more effectively than a volley of arrows. But the true artistry lay in traps, improvised horrors that turned the fortress itself into a predator. At Carcassonne, defenders rigged collapsing staircases to send attackers tumbling into pits of smoldering charcoal. The Byzantines at Nicaea greased their outer walls with animal fat, transforming a straightforward escalade into a macabre comedy of slipping, sliding soldiers. And then there were the psychological masterstrokes. The defenders of Chateau de Coucy once suspended a single, blood-stained gauntlet from the gatehouse, swaying gently in the wind. No explanation, no threat, just a silent question mark that gnawed at the besiegers' resolve. What had happened to the man who wore it? Would his fate be theirs? The most chilling innovations, however, were reserved for the end game. When all hope was lost, these cornered warriors embraced a final principle: if we're going down, we're taking you with us. At the siege of Szigetvár in 1566, Croatian defenders packed their last remaining gunpowder into the castle's foundations. As Ottoman troops poured through the breaches, a single spark turned the entire fortress into a funeral pyre, consuming victor and vanquished alike. Similarly, crusaders at Crac des Chevaliers spiked their own wine stores with belladonna, leaving casks gifted to the besieging Mamluks as a parting act of vengeance. What made these tactics so unforgettable wasn't just their brutality, it was their inventiveness. A starving garrison didn't see empty storerooms, they saw potential. A broken chandelier became a swinging mace, a stable's worth of horseshoes transformed into caltrops. Even the castle's sacred bells melted down for shrapnel. These weren't acts of madness, but of cold, calculated defiance, because in the end, the message wasn't just, "You can't have this fortress." It was, "You'll wish you'd never tried." The ultimate act of defiance wasn't just dying on your feet, it was ensuring the enemy triumphed over ashes. Scorched earth tactics turned surrender into a paradox. Why would anyone burn their own home, their own history, to the ground? Because for these defenders, legacy outweighed loot. When Prince Dmitry of Moscow faced the Golden Horde in the 14th century, he didn't just evacuate his people, he ordered the city set ablaze. The Mongols rode into a smoldering ruin, finding no food, no shelter, no prize worth the blood they'd spilled. Dmitry's gamble that a hollow victory would starve future invasions. And it worked. The Horde's grip on Russia frayed, not from battle, but from the chilling realization that some foes would rather erase themselves than be conquered. But the most haunting examples weren't just about denying resources, they were about rewriting history itself. At Masada, Jewish rebels chose fire over Roman chains, leaving behind only silent coins and charred prayer scrolls. Centuries later, the Spanish at Numancia echoed their defiance, burning their granaries and throwing themselves into the flames rather than endure slavery. These weren't retreats, they were final performances where the stage itself was consumed in the closing act. The message to the victors was clear: you didn't defeat us. You inherited our funeral pyre, Yet some commanders took this logic further, weaponizing not just their fortresses, but their enemies' superstitions. When the Knights Templar abandoned Chateau Pellerin in 1291, they didn't just torch it, they salted the earth and scrawled curses on the collapsing walls in goat's blood. To the Mamluks who marched in, the ruins felt less like a conquest and more like a haunted tomb. The psychological toll outweighed any strategic gain. Why celebrate a victory when the air itself tasted of damnation? Then there were those who defied even this final option. Escape artists like the defenders of Montségur, who slipped through enemy lines under cover of fog, or the Byzantine Admiral Eustathios, who disguised his entire garrison as fishermen to evade a Saracen blockade. Their refusal to play the expected role martyr or arsonist frustrated chroniclers and conquerors alike, because history loves clear endings, heroes who die spectacularly, or villains who reap their just deserts. But the ones who vanished into the night, they left behind a different kind of legend, one that whispered no fortress is truly fallen until the last defender chooses how their story ends. Beneath the crumbling battlements and echoing war cries, another battle raged, one fought in near silence, where picks bit into rock and dirt piled up in secret corners. While some fortresses made their last stand above ground, others waged war in the darkness below, turning the very earth beneath their feet into a weapon. These weren't just tunnels, they were acts of defiance carved in stone. Take Montségur, the mountaintop stronghold of the Cathars, where besieged heretics dug not for water or supplies but for freedom. For months they chiseled a hidden route down the cliff face, their work muffled by the constant din of siege engines above. Then, on a moonless night in 1244, dozens slipped through the mountain's belly like ghosts, leaving their enemies to storm an empty shell at dawn. The tunnel bought them more than escape, it robbed their persecutors of the satisfaction of martyrdom. Yet for every Montségur, there were tunnels that became tombs. At the Siege of Candia in 1669, Venetian defenders spent months excavating a passage to smuggle in reinforcements only for the Ottomans to intercept it, flooding the narrow shaft with seawater and drowning the would-be rescuers. The difference between salvation and slaughter often came down to a single misaligned pickstroke or a traitor's whisper, and sometimes the tunnels themselves turned traitor. During the Albigensian Crusade, besiegers at Minerve catapulted rotting carcasses into the fortress's sole well, poisoning the water supply. Desperate defenders tunneled outward to reach a spring only to break through directly into the enemy's sapping trench, their lifeline becoming a highway for invasion. The most ingenious escapes blended engineering with psychological warfare. When Saladin's forces surrounded Carrac Castle in 1183, the defenders didn't just dig, they staged an elaborate ruse. Each night they lowered empty coffins into the moat, letting the current carry them downstream. Saladin's sentries, assuming they contained plague victims, avoided the grim flotilla. In reality, those coffins carried tools, food, and messages until the night they carried men. By the time the ruse was discovered, half the garrison had vanished, leaving behind a fortress manned by straw-stuffed dummies propped on the walls. But the ultimate subterranean gambit belonged to the defenders of Rhodes in 1522. Facing certain defeat, they secreted their most sacred relics and a handful of knights into a labyrinth of catacombs beneath the city. As Suleiman's troops celebrated above, these hidden survivors waited months before emerging to smuggle the relics to safety. Their persistence transformed military defeat into spiritual victory, ensuring the Order of St. John lived to fight another day. That's the true power of these hidden passages. They didn't just save lives, they salvaged legacies from the ashes of defeat. Because in the end, a fortress isn't just stones and mortar. It's the will to endure even when the walls fall, and sometimes that will runs deepest when it's buried in the dark. The greatest threat to any besieged fortress wasn't the army outside its walls, it was the doubt creeping through its corridors. A starving child's whimper, a whispered conversation cut short, the way a guard's eyes lingered too long on the weakest section of the defenses. Betrayal festered in these silences. Take the infamous Kirkaport incident during the siege of Constantinople in 1453. After weeks of relentless bombardment, a small postern gate was left unsecured not by neglect, but because a bribed sentry pretended not to notice the oversight. Ottoman troops poured through the gap, turning the tide of history in minutes. The irony, that gate had withstood cannon fire but crumbled to something far simpler: human greed. Yet not all betrayals were born of gold or threats. Sometimes desperation wore down loyalty like water on stone. During the siege of Paris in 885, townspeople lowered ropes to Viking raiders after months of eating rats and boiling leather for broth. Who could blame them? Survival instinct cuts deeper than oaths when children's bellies swell with hunger. More chilling were the calculated betrayals, like the Templar sergeant at Safed in 1266, who traded secret tunnel maps to the Mamluks in exchange for his life, only to be beheaded anyway as the enemy honored their word technically. His head still rolled just outside the fortress walls instead of within them, but history reserves its strangest twists for those who betrayed their betrayers. At the siege of Antioch in 1098, an Armenian tower guard named Fervor first sold out his fellow defenders to the Seljuks then. Racked with guilt, helped crusaders scale the very walls he'd sworn to protect. His motives remain murky, but the lesson is clear. In the pressure cooker of a siege, allegiance could flip faster than a coin. The same happened centuries later at La Rochelle, where a Huguenot turncoat fed false intelligence to the Catholic besiegers, then led his former comrades into an ambush that shattered the blockade. The most devastating betrayals weren't dramatic midnight conspiracies, but slow erosions of trust. A commander noticing his orders took too long to reach the archers. A well that suddenly ran dry after being fine for weeks. The creeping realization that someone, maybe even someone you broke bread with, was measuring your life against a bag of silver or a loaf of bread. In the end, no wall could defend against that, because while stone and mortar could be reinforced, the human heart, that was the one fortress gate no engineer could ever fully secure. Nothing unsettled a besieging army quite like the sight of a white flag fluttering above a fortress gate. After weeks or months of bloodshed, the promise of surrender offered sweet relief, but seasoned commanders knew to watch for the dagger behind the olive branch. Feigned capitulation was the medieval equivalent of a Trojan horse, a gambit where the rules of war bent like a bowstring pulled to breaking. Take the infamous siege of Besiegers in 1209. The Cathar defenders sent out envoys pleading for mercy, even as they smuggled armed men into the city's subterranean tunnels. When the Crusaders marched in, expecting to accept swords laid at their feet, they instead walked into a slaughterhouse. Streets erupted with hidden attackers, siege engines were torched from within, and by nightfall the entire city burned, a funeral pyre lit by broken trust. Yet the true masters of this deadly theater weren't those who succeeded, but those who made their enemies believe failure was part of the script. At the siege of Acre in 1191, Saladin's forces allowed Crusader troops to enter the city unopposed, only to seal the gates behind them. What looked like surrender was actually a trap, with archers waiting on rooftops and boiling oil poured through hidden chutes. The lesson: a white flag wasn't just fabric, it was a psychological weapon. Defenders exploited the human craving for resolution, the visceral relief that comes when pain stops, and in that moment of lowered guard, they struck. But the risk was astronomical. A failed bluff meant annihilation without honor. When the garrison at Al-Raba tried feigning surrender to the Mongols in 1260, Hulagu's generals simply set the entire fortress ablaze during the celebration, roasting defenders and occupiers alike. Other besiegers developed brutal countermeasures, forcing surrendering troops to disarm completely before entry, or holding commanders' families hostage during negotiations. The most cunning response came from Richard the Lionheart at Cyprus in 1191. Suspecting a ruse, he ordered his men to accept the surrender, then immediately build a second wall around the first, trapping the would-be trappers inside their own fortress. The brilliance of these deceptions lay in their duality. A feigned surrender wasn't just about killing enemies, it was about making future surrenders impossible. Every broken truce poisoned the well for the next garrison genuinely seeking mercy. That's why the defenders of Stirling Castle in 1304 took the opposite approach. After luring English forces inside with a false surrender, they spared the high-ranking hostages. The message, "We could have slaughtered you all, remember that next time." Sometimes the deadliest trick wasn't the massacre itself, but the fear it planted in every besieger's mind for generations to come. A fortress on the brink of collapse had one last arrow in its quiver, the power of pure imagination. When steel and stone failed, defenders turned to psychological warfare so audacious, it blurred the line between desperation and genius. Take the legendary siege of Rhodes in 1522, where the Knights Hospitaller faced an Ottoman armada with dwindling gunpowder. Their solution, they loaded cannons with sacks of dust and fired them at regular intervals, the thunderous booms convincing Suleiman's fleet that Rhodes' arsenal remained inexhaustible. For days, the ruse held, buying precious time as defenders scrambled to repair breaches under cover of their own fictional firepower. But empty cannons were just the beginning. Commanders mastered the art of weaving entire narratives to unnerve their enemies. At the siege of Château-Gaillard, French defenders rolled barrels filled with rocks down the hillside at night, the cacophony mimicking the arrival of a relief force. Ottoman chronicles recount how the garrison of Belgrade in 1456 spread rumors of a phantom plague, dressing healthy men in stained rags and staging mock funerals within view of maimed troops. The effect was instant. The Sultan's medics demanded a quarantine, stalling the assault for weeks. Even the weather could become part of the charade. During the defense of Malta, the Knights of St. John lit massive bonfires atop their bastions, the swirling smoke creating the illusion of reinforcements arriving by sea. To the besieging Ottomans peering through the haze, every shadow seemed to hide an army. The cruelest trick, making the enemy doubt their own eyes. At the siege of Harfleur, English defenders draped cloaks over bundles of straw, propping them along the battlements like an endless line of archers. From a distance, the ruse worked until a sudden rainstorm exposed the truth. Yet even failed bluffs served a purpose. They forced attackers to hesitate, to question, to waste time verifying threats that didn't exist. And in siege warfare, hesitation was a currency more valuable than gold. But when the final bluff failed, when the last imaginary ally failed to materialize, defenders faced a choice: die on their knees or script their own endings. At Shajdvar in 1566, Count Zerinsky didn't wait for the Ottomans to breach his gates. He led his remaining men in a final, suicidal charge, their scarlet cloaks billowing like flames against the dawn. They died to a man, but their defiance etched the battle into legend. Similarly, the Cathars of Montségur chose the pyre over conversion, their singing audible even as the flames consumed them. These weren't surrenders to fate, they were acts of authorship, the last defiant edits to a story others thought they'd already written, because in the end, a fortress wasn't just a pile of stones. It was the will to make your enemies remember, not how you fell, but how fiercely you forced them to fight for every inch. Some cultures forged their identities in the white-hot crucible of refusal, where surrender wasn't just defeat, but a stain that burned deeper than death itself. The Iberian warriors of Numancia didn't merely resist Rome. They set their world aflame, choosing collective suicide over chains. Centuries later, their story still scorches the pages of history, not because of tactics or terrain, but because they transformed annihilation into a language of defiance. How does an act of desperation become legend? Through the alchemy of mythmakers, bards who sang their deeds, chroniclers who sharpened their choices into parables, and enemies who unwittingly immortalized them by whispering, even in victory, we could not break them. The Norse sagas offer a darker mirror to this creed. When Viking lords faced certain death, they didn't just fall. They staged holmgangs, ritual duels in the shadow of doom, ensuring their names would echo in skaldic verse. At Stamford Bridge in 1066, a lone axeman allegedly held off an entire English army long enough for his comrades to form a shield wall. Historians debate the truth, but the power lies in the telling. By embedding such acts in oral tradition, the Norse weaponized memory itself. A warrior's death wasn't an end, it was a seed planted in the minds of future enemies, sprouting into fear every time a new generation heard the tale. Bushido codified this refusal into philosophy. For samurai like those at Fushimi Castle in 1600, surrender wasn't just dishonorable, it erased one's very existence from the collective memory. Seppuku wasn't suicide, it was the ultimate editorial act, a way to curate one's legacy with a blade's precision. When the castle fell, defenders burned their banners rather than let them be taken as trophies, then opened their own veins in unison. To the victorious Tokugawa forces, the message was clear: you inherit nothing but ashes, yet the most potent mythmakers were often the victors themselves. Roman historians, eager to justify the brutal conquest of Numancia, inadvertently immortalized its defiance by painting it as a tragedy of noble savagery. Crusader chroniclers, horrified by the Hashashin's suicidal loyalty, spun their acts into grotesque legends that outlived the order itself. Even the Mongols, who razed cities to their foundations, found themselves haunted by the stories of defenders who'd laughed as the walls fell. This was the paradox of the no-surrender creed. The very cultures that demanded annihilation in battle also ensured their destruction wasn't the end, it was the opening stanza of an epic. Because when myth takes root, even a pile of bones can become a monument, and a name spoken in awe centuries later. That's the true victory no army can ever conquer. Dying well wasn't just about courage, it was about curation. In the final hours of a siege, defenders became playwrights, poets, and propagandists, scripting their own legends with every stroke of a quill or swing of a sword. Consider the Alamo's doomed garrison, scribbling farewell letters in the flickering candlelight. They didn't just write to loved ones, they wrote to history, embedding phrases like victory or death, knowing those words would outlive them. And it worked. Their ink-stained defiance turned a military disaster into a rallying cry that would echo across Texas. But this wasn't unique to the 19th century. Medieval defenders mastered the art of legacy building too, etching their stories into the collective memory long before the first stone fell. Take the Knights Templar at Acre in 1291. As Mamluk forces breached the walls, a group of knights gathered in the chapel not just to pray, but to compose a final ballad, a song so haunting, surviving crusaders carried it back to Europe like a sacred relic. Within months, their elegy was being sung in taverns from Paris to Prague, transforming a tactical defeat into a spiritual triumph. Similarly, Byzantine defenders at Constantinople in 1453 scrawled verses from Homer onto their shields, ensuring even in death they'd be remembered as heirs to ancient heroes. These weren't spontaneous acts, they were calculated performances for an audience of future generations, yet not every last stand earned a glorious epitaph. For every Alamo, there was a Château de Salses in 1503 where French defenders, after months of starvation, staggered out to surrender only to be slaughtered mid-gesture. Their story survives as a cautionary tale, not of heroism but of timing, the difference, control. The Alamo's defenders died on their terms in a narrative they'd shaped. The men at Salses lost that privilege the moment their knees hit the mud. The most brilliant legacy crafting blurred truth and theater. During the siege of Shyjtvar, Count Zerinsky ordered his musicians to play as Ottoman cannonballs shattered the walls. The surreal juxtaposition of violins and violence unnerved the attackers more than any battle cry. Even in failure, he ensured history would remember the moment as sublime defiance, not desperate collapse. Meanwhile, at Montségur, Cathar priests staged a dawn procession before their burning pyres, their chants rising with the smoke, a final sermon visible for miles. But the darkest twist, sometimes the victors hijacked the narrative. After crushing the Jacquerie peasant revolt in 1358, French nobles forced survivors to reenact their rebellion as a farce before executing them. The message was clear: even your defiance belongs to us now. That's why the smartest doomed commanders burned their archives, smashed their seals, and rewrote their epitaphs in real time. Because in the end, a last stand wasn't just a military act, it was a bid for immortality. And the winners weren't always the ones who lived. They were the ones who made sure their story did. For every fortress that carved its name into legend with a final, glorious counterattack, 100 more met only silence and the sword. The aftermath of failed defiance was often a spectacle of calculated terror, a warning etched in blood for the next generation who might consider resistance. When Saladin retook Jerusalem in 1187, his mercy had limits. The city's Christian defenders were spared massacre, but only after paying crippling ransoms that left families destitute. Those who couldn't pay, enslaved. The streets ran not with blood, but with the clink of chains and the wails of separated children. Yet even this grim clemency was rare. More typical was the fate of Acre's garrison in 1291, where the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, enraged by months of costly siege, ordered every surviving Templar and Hospitaller thrown from the battlements. Their bodies shattered on the rocks below, a grisly lesson in the arithmetic of power. But the true horror lay in the details. After the fall of Montségur, the victorious French crown didn't just burn the Cathar heretics, they forced their own soldiers to construct the pyres, twisting the act of surrender into complicity. In Hungary, Ottoman conquerors at Eger in 1556 used a darker innovation. They impaled surviving defenders along the very roads they'd once patrolled, transforming familiar landscapes into galleries of nightmares. These weren't just punishments, they were psychological weapons designed to unravel a culture's will to resist. A broken fortress could be rebuilt, a broken people. That was the goal, yet in the ashes of these failures, something unexpected often smoldered. The mass enslavement of Jerusalem's citizens in 1187 scattered survivors across the Islamic world, where they whispered tales of the city's fall to new ears. Within a generation, those stories helped fuel the Third Crusade. Similarly, the few Templars who escaped Acre's slaughter became living ghosts, their whispered testimonies inspiring fresh resistance from Cyprus to Scotland. Even the Mongols, masters of terror, discovered the limits of fear. After massacring the defenders of Kiev in 1240, they expected submission. Instead, the survivors' ballads of defiance seeped into the groundwater of Slavic culture, fermenting a resistance that would eventually expel the Golden Horde. The cruelest irony, many reprisals backfired spectacularly. When the Spanish executed Dutch rebels by immuring them alive in the ruins of Haarlem in 1573, they created martyrs' icons of resistance that fueled 80 years of war. The very act of crushing defiance often planted its seeds deeper, because while victors could destroy bodies, they couldn't control how those bodies were remembered. A corpse left to rot on a gibbet might terrify today, but by tomorrow, it could become a shrine, and by next year, a rallying cry. That's why the smartest conquerors, from Rome to the Ottomans, eventually learned to temper vengeance with pragmatism. Because the line between a warning and a spark was perilously thin, and history's greatest empires knew, it only takes one spark to light a fire that outlasts stone, steel, and even memory itself. The echoes of a defiant last stand rarely faded with the falling of the fortress walls. Instead, they rippled outward, bending the arc of history in ways both subtle and seismic. Masada's tragic end in the 1st century didn't just mark the fall of a Jewish stronghold, it became a rallying cry for generations. When Roman legionaries finally breached the summit, they found only silence and ashes. Yet that silence spoke volumes. Centuries later, Zionist rebels would invoke Masada's name during their own struggles, turning a military defeat into a symbol of unyielding resistance. The lesson was clear: sometimes losing well could inspire more than winning ever could. Across the medieval world, these acts of defiance became psychological landmines buried in the collective memory. The Battle of the Hornburg, immortalized in Tolkien's lore but rooted in real sieges like Helm's Deep, showcased how a handful of defenders could fracture an invader's confidence. When Theodred's riders charged into certain death, they didn't just buy time. They exposed the fragility of Saruman's seemingly unstoppable army. Real-world parallels abound. The Swiss at Morgarten in 1315, outnumbered 10-1, turned a mountain pass into a slaughterhouse for Habsburg knights. Their victory didn't just secure independence, it shattered the myth of feudal invincibility, proving that sheer will could outweigh steel and numbers. But the most potent legacy of these stands lay in their ability to rewrite narratives. The Great Siege of Malta in 1565 should have been an Ottoman triumph. Instead, the knights' refusal to break transformed a tiny island into a symbol of Christian resilience, stalling Islam's westward advance. Similarly, the defenders of Vienna in 1683 didn't just repel the Turks, they punctured the aura of Ottoman inevitability, triggering the empire's long decline. These weren't just battles, they were turning points where perception shifted, where the underdog's defiance exposed the emperor's nakedness. Could such tactics work today? Modern warfare's precision drones and satellite surveillance might seem to render medieval defiance obsolete, yet the essence remains. Ukraine's defense of Mariupol's Azovstal plant in 2022 proved that even in the digital age, a determined few can tie down armies, sap morale, and become global symbols. The difference now is amplification. Where once a ballad might spread a defender's story, today a single tweet can ignite worldwide solidarity. But the calculus hasn't changed. Whether with swords or smartphones, those who choose to stand and fall on their own terms still hold the power to shape what comes after. Because history isn't just written by the victors, it's whispered first by the defiant. The psychology of a last stand transcends time and technology. What worked for medieval defenders still echoes in the smoke of modern battlefields. Take Stalingrad in 1942, where Soviet soldiers turned a ruined city into a labyrinth of death, much like the defenders of Carcassonne greasing their walls 6 centuries earlier. Both understood a fundamental truth: when you can't win conventionally, you weaponize the terrain itself. The same ingenuity that had medieval knights dropping beehives on attackers resurfaced in Vietnam, where guerrillas rigged jungle paths with punji stakes dipped in sewage, turning minor wounds into fatal infections. Desperation doesn't just level the playing field, it redesigns the game. Yet the most striking parallel lies in the theater of the mind. Medieval defenders lighting phantom bonfires to simulate reinforcements would have recognized the tactics of the Mujahideen in 1980s Afghanistan, who broadcast fake radio chatter to convince Soviet troops of imaginary battalions lurking in the mountains. And just as Saladin's forces hesitated at the sight of Crusader priests chanting on Jerusalem's walls, modern soldiers report unease when insurgents blare eerie music or recite verses before an ambush. Fear, it seems, speaks the same language across the centuries, but how much of what we celebrate is myth? The Alamo's defenders likely never drew a line in the sand. That detail was added decades later to sell books. Similarly, the iconic image of Spartans at Thermopylae fighting to the last man ignores the historical reality that many Greeks surrendered or fled. Even the siege of Malta, often portrayed as a pure Christian triumph, relied heavily on covert aid from Muslim corsairs who despised the Ottomans more than the knights. These stories get polished into propaganda because we crave clean narratives of heroism, not messy truths where survival sometimes meant compromise. The darkest lesson, though, is how easily defiance curdles into fanaticism. Medieval Cathars burning themselves alive rather than convert find their mirror in ISIS fighters detonating suicide vests when cornered. Both groups weaponized their own annihilation, understanding that a spectacular death could recruit more followers than any victory. Modern generals studying medieval sieges aren't just learning tactics, they're confronting an uncomfortable question: when does resilience become a cult of martyrdom? Perhaps that's why these stories endure. They force us to ask what we'd sacrifice when the walls close in, and whether the legends we create afterwards bear any resemblance to the blood and chaos of the moment. The truth is messier than the ballads, but no less compelling because it reveals humanity at its rawest, where innovation and brutality walk hand in hand toward the same inevitable end. Hollywood would have us believe every last stand ends in slow-motion glory, a handful of heroes cutting down endless foes before falling in a picturesque heap. Reality, as usual, refuses to follow the script. Take the infamous Battle of Thermopylae. While 300 Spartans did hold the pass, they weren't alone. 7,000 allied Greeks fought alongside them, and many survived by retreating when the position became untenable. Even King Leonidas's death wasn't the solo last charge we see on screen. Historical accounts suggest he was struck down by arrows early in the final assault. The myth eclipsed the messier truth because clean narratives sell tickets, but they erase the real ingenuity of desperate defenders. Consider the Alamo's legend versus its ledger. Films depict every defender fighting to the death, but records show at least 20 men surrendered, including Davy Crockett. Their fates were far grimmer than the movies admit, executed on Santa Anna's orders. The no survivors trope serves drama, not history. In reality, many last stands included negotiated exits, covert escapes, or even staged surrenders that turned into ambushes. The defenders of Chateau Gaillard in 1204 didn't just die heroically. They faked a capitulation, lured the enemy inside, then sprang traps that killed hundreds. That's not cinematic, it's cunning. Then there's the myth of unanimity. Pop culture paints these final hours as moments of unshaken resolve, but siege accounts reveal fractures. At the Siege of Malta, starving defenders argued bitterly over whether to eat the last horses or risk a suicidal sortie. The Templars at Acre split into factions, some tunneling to escape, others vowing to immolate themselves in the chapel. These tensions don't diminish their courage, they humanize it. Defiance isn't just born from unity. Sometimes it's the compromise between those who want to fight and those who see survival as its own rebellion. The real architects of defiance weren't always the commanders immortalized in bronze. They were the anonymous sappers who rigged tunnels to collapse on invaders, the cooks who turned kitchen knives into weapons, or the scribes who forged surrender documents with hidden clauses. At the siege of Shyjvar, the unsung hero wasn't Count Zerinsky, it was the unnamed gunner who calculated the exact moment to ignite the powder stores, ensuring the blast took out the Ottoman command tent. These aren't the stories that fit neatly into epics, but they're the ones that changed outcomes. What makes the truth stranger and richer than the legend? The sheer adaptability of those cornered. When the Vikings besieged Paris in 885, the defenders didn't just hurl rocks from the walls. They greased the city's famous bridges, turning them into ice like death slides for attackers. At Antioch, starving crusaders staged a feast with empty plates to convince the enemy they still had supplies, then attacked mid-bluff. These weren't scripted heroics. They were the chaotic, improvisational brilliance of people with nothing left to lose. So why does Hollywood flatten these complexities? Because paradoxes don't fit on posters. Audiences crave clear heroes and villains, not the moral grays of a garrison that both negotiated and booby-trapped. But the messy truth holds a different power. It shows us that defiance isn't a monolith. It's the sum of 1,000 desperate choices, some noble, some ruthless, all undeniably human. And that's a story worth telling straight. When the history books recount tales of besieged fortresses, they often etch the names of knights and kings into memory, but the true spine of resistance was rarely steel-clad. Behind every last stand stood women grinding glass into flour to blind attackers, children smuggling arrows through secret tunnels, and elderly craftsmen reforging kitchen knives into daggers. The Siege of Neuss in 1474 shattered the myth that war belonged only to warriors. As Burgundian forces surrounded the city, its entire population, bakers, weavers, even clergy, took up positions on the crumbling walls. Women boiled vats of oil and fat to pour through murder holes, while teenage apprentices manned makeshift trebuchets hurling stones chiseled from their own homes. This wasn't just desperation, it was democracy in its rawest form. Every hand that could hold a tool became a weapon. Every voice that could shout became a war cry. Consider the untold ingenuity of non-combatants under siege. At the Siege of Haarlem in 1573, Dutch fishwives devised a brutal innovation. They strung gutted herring with hooks and draped them across breaches like macabre garlands, snaring Spanish soldiers in a tangle of rusted metal and rotting scales. In Constantinople, nuns stripped lead from church roofs to cast bullets, while scribes forged deceptive surrender letters to buy time. Even the youngest played their part. Children in Kaffa during the Mongol siege reportedly released cages of starving rats into enemy trenches, spreading panic and disease. These weren't bystanders caught in the crossfire, they were tacticians rewriting the rules of engagement. Yet the ethics of such total mobilization haunt these stories. When every life becomes a weapon, where does consent begin? At La Réole in 1224, French defenders welded shut the city gates to prevent civilians from fleeing, forcing them to fight or starve. Jewish communities trapped in besieged Mainz in 1096 faced an even grimmer calculus: die by crusader swords or take their own lives in ritual suicide. The line between collective defiance and collective coercion blurs in the smoke of burning cities. Modern scholars still grapple with these paradoxes. Was the baker who threw stones from the ramparts a hero or a hostage? The answer often depends on who writes the history. What's undeniable is how these forgotten defenders reshaped warfare's psychology. An army expecting to fight only soldiers suddenly faced grandmothers dropping millstones from rooftops and priests swinging censers filled with burning pitch. At Montsegur, Cathar women allegedly sang hymns as they stitched makeshift armor from boiled leather, their voices rising above the crash of catapults. That dissonance, the sacred and the savage entwined, unsettled attackers more than any battle cry. Because how do you vanquish an enemy when the enemy is everyone? The legacy of these ordinary resistors lingers in unexpected places. The Ukrainian defense of Mariupol in 2022 echoed Noos's spirit, with nurses doubling as snipers and mechanics building anti-tank barriers from scrap metal. Centuries change, but the calculus of communal survival remains. When the walls close in, the most potent weapon isn't a sword, it's the unbreakable web of human ingenuity, where every thread, no matter how seemingly fragile, becomes essential to the whole. And perhaps that's the ultimate defiance, proving that courage wears as many faces as a besieged city holds souls. The line between courage and catastrophe is often drawn in the blood of those who chose to stand when every rational voice screamed retreat. Was it noble to fight knowing defeat was certain, or reckless to trade living hearts for dead legends? Ancient philosophers like Seneca praised such defiance as the ultimate assertion of human will, while Machiavelli dismissed it as wasted effort, better to survive and fight another day. Yet history's verdict is rarely so binary. The defenders of Masada didn't just take their own lives, they denied Rome the satisfaction of conquest, transforming their deaths into a spiritual victory that outlasted the empire itself. But at what cost? 900 souls erased in a single night, leaving only silence and charred bones where families once laughed. Consider the chilling calculus of command. When the Byzantine general Belisarius ordered the gates of Rome welded shut during the Gothic siege of 537, he wasn't just protecting a city, he was gambling with every civilian inside. The move worked, breaking the Ostrogoths' momentum, but trapped mothers and children endured months of starvation as collateral. Contrast this with the samurai code of Bushido, where surrender meant eternal dishonor. At Fushimi Castle, retainers burned their own wives and children before charging into oblivion, believing death purified shame. Two cultures, two extremes, one prioritizing strategic survival, the other ritual purity. Which was right? The answer depends on whether you measure value in lives saved or ideals preserved. Even the victors grappled with doubt. After crushing the Jacobite rebellion at Culloden in 1746, British officers wrote of unease watching Highlanders charge into cannon fire without muskets, some armed only with stones. Their courage was undeniable, but their sacrifice prolonged a lost cause, costing clans their last surviving sons. Similarly, Confederate generals at Gettysburg sent Pickett's division on a suicidal advance, knowing it couldn't alter the war's outcome. Was this bravery or butchery? The grieving mothers in Richmond had one answer, the poets who mythologized the gallant charge another. Perhaps the most haunting perspective comes from those who refused the script entirely. During the siege of La Rochelle, Huguenot women smuggled children through sewers to safety rather than let them become symbols of martyrdom. Their quiet exodus left no ballads but hundreds of lineages that might have otherwise ended on the ramparts. Does their choice make them less courageous or more human? The tension between duty and survival pulses through every great last stand story, because it forces us to ask ourselves the unanswerable. What would we burn and what would we save when the torch is in our hand? Yet for all the debates, one truth endures: these acts mattered precisely because they were unnecessary. A world where every army surrenders at the first setback is a world without Thermopylae, without the Alamo, without the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. The symbolic power of resistance has toppled empires long after the fighters fell. When Tibetan monks faced Chinese tanks in 1959, their homemade flags and silent sit-down strikes echoed the Cathars' final procession at Montségur. Both knew they couldn't win, both fought anyway, and in that refusal, that glorious, terrible insistence on agency even in annihilation, they reshaped what victory means. Not the preservation of life, but the defiance of oblivion. Not the avoidance of death, but the authorship of its terms. So where does that leave us? Maybe the real question isn't whether these stands were right or wrong, but why they still grip us centuries later. Could it be that in a universe indifferent to human struggle, these flashes of defiance, however futile, are the closest we come to touching the divine? A way to scream into the void that for one brief, blazing moment we controlled the story. The walls always fall in the end, but the echo of their falling belongs to those who decided how they'd meet the ground. There's something primal in the way our hearts race when we hear tales of doomed last stands, how a handful of rebels, knights, or soldiers stare down annihilation and choose to fight anyway. These stories echo far beyond the battlefields where they began, woven into the fabric of our culture, from Homer's epics to blockbuster films, and even the pixelated heroics of video games. But why? What is it about certain defeat that ignites our imagination so fiercely? Part of it, undoubtedly, is the raw, unyielding courage on display. There's a magnetic pull in witnessing someone refuse to bow, even when the outcome is sealed. It's the same instinct that makes us lean in when a hero in a movie stands alone against an army, or when a sports team mounts a hopeless comeback. We crave that moment where the human spirit, against all logic, declares itself unconquered. Yet there's a darker undercurrent to the unsettling thrill of watching tragedy unfold. The Germans call it Schadenfreude, but this isn't quite that. It's more like a fascination with the sublime horror of inevitability, the same reason we can't look away from a storm or a wildfire. When the defenders of Masada chose mass suicide over Roman enslavement, or when the Spartans at Thermopylae laughed in the face of certain death, their actions transcended mere battle tactics. They became spectacles of defiance, moments where the line between bravery and madness blurred, and we're drawn to that edge, to the question it forces us to ask ourselves, what would I do? But the most compelling reason these stories endure is the way they twist fate into legacy. A last stand isn't just about dying, it's about controlling the narrative of your own end. Think of the Alamo, where a military disaster was reborn as a rallying cry, or the siege of Shyjtvar, where Count Zhirinsky's suicidal charge became a symbol of national pride. These defenders knew they couldn't win, but they could choose how they lost, and in that choice they stole something precious from their conquerors, the final word. History is written by the victors, but legends, those belong to the defiant. Perhaps that's why these tales resonate across centuries and cultures. They remind us that even in the face of oblivion, there's a power in agency, in deciding the tone of your own ending. Whether it's the Cathars singing as they burned or the samurai of Fushimi Castle turning their deaths into art, these stories whisper a universal truth: how you fall can echo louder than the fact you fell at all. And so, long after the stones of their fortresses have crumbled to dust, the defenders' ghosts still walk among us, not as victims, but as authors of their own unforgettable last lines. Standing in the shadow of Carcassonne's double walls today, it's hard not to feel the ghosts of defiance clinging to the weathered stone. The same ramparts where defenders once poured boiling oil now host tourists snapping selfies, yet the air hums with something deeper, a resonance that transcends time. Run your fingers along the grooves in the limestone, worn smooth by centuries of weather and warfare, and you're touching the same surfaces where desperate hands once steadied crossbows or braced against battering rams. These ruins aren't just relics, they're open-air classrooms where the past lectures in silence. Climb the steps of Dungeon Mountain's collapsed keep, where jagged fragments of towers claw at the sky like broken teeth, and you'll notice something unsettling: the acoustics. A shout from the ruin's highest point carries unnaturally far, just as it would have when sentries spotted approaching armies. The architects of these strongholds didn't just build for defense, they engineered spaces where every whisper could become a weapon. Modern visitors often pause mid-step, struck by the realization that they're walking a stage where life and death played out in brutal clarity, the uneven stones underfoot. Those aren't natural wear, they're the scars of siege engines, the grooves carved by dragged bodies, the subtle dips where generations of defenders stood sentry until their boots wore troughs into the rock. What these sites teach us goes beyond military tactics. At Crac des Chevaliers, the Hospitaller fortress in Syria, the surviving frescoes in the chapel show saints with serene faces painted by men who knew they might be dead by dawn. In the citadel's latrines, archaeologists found chess pieces carved from bone, a testament to how normalcy persisted even in siege grip. These details humanize the defiance, reminding us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to plant flowers in the cracks of a crumbling world. The most haunting lessons emerge from the scars left intentionally. At Montségur, where Cathars made their last stand, the rebuilt walls incorporate charred stones from the original pyres, a deliberate memorial to the heretics who burned. In Rhodes, the Knights Hospitaller's secret tunnel, once their escape route, now sits illuminated by respectful spotlights, transforming a tactical passage into a pilgrimage site. These places force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. We venerate what we once destroyed. The same stones that were targets for catapults are now protected as heritage, their defenders' rebellion commodified into ticket stubs and guidebooks. Yet for all the crowds and curation, moments of raw connection still break through. Stand alone at dusk in the ruined chapel of Chateau Gaillard, and you might hear the faint echo of a knight's prayer bouncing off stones that haven't forgotten. Touch the soot-blackened walls of Scheidvar's basement armory, where Zirinsky's men packed their final gunpowder charge, and the line between past and present blurs. These sites hold a peculiar magic, the power to collapse centuries into a single heartbeat. What do we take from these whispering stones? Not just admiration for the past, but a mirror held up to our own capacity for resistance. The children who scrambled through Montségur's secret escape tunnel weren't so different from refugees fleeing modern wars. The cooks who turned kitchen tools into weapons at Neus would recognize the ingenuity of Ukrainian civilians crafting Molotov cocktails. The human spirit's refusal to be extinguished hasn't changed, only the battlefields have. Perhaps that's why we keep returning to these broken walls and overgrown moats. They're not just monuments to the dead, but compasses for the living. In a world where so many fights feel unwinnable, where overwhelm and apathy loom like besieging armies, these ruins murmur a stubborn truth: defeat is inevitable only if you let it write your entire story. The defenders of these fortresses teach us that how you meet the end matters as much as the end itself. Their stones don't just remember, they dare us to be remembered too. The crumbling stones of these fortresses whisper more than just tales of battles lost. They hold up a mirror to the human soul, reflecting our deepest fears and fiercest resolve. These stories of doomed defiance aren't relics of a distant past. They're blueprints of the choices we might face when our own walls begin to shake. Think about the ingenuity of those defenders turning beehives into weapons, whispers into psychological warfare, even their own starvation into a feigned feast. It wasn't just survival they were after, it was agency, the chance to say, this is how my story ends, and isn't that a struggle we all recognize, whether it's a parent fighting for a child's future, an activist standing against impossible odds, or simply someone refusing to let a diagnosis define them, the same spark flickers in the dark. Leadership, too, takes on a new light when viewed through these sieges. The commanders who stood on broken battlements, polishing their swords in full view of the enemy, understood something timeless: courage is contagious. But so is fear. The difference between a garrison that shattered under pressure and one that rallied for a final, furious charge often came down to a single voice, someone who could turn despair into defiance. That's a power each of us carries, whether in a boardroom, a classroom, or a living room. The question isn't just would I rise to the occasion, but who might rise because I did. Yet these stories also force us to confront the cost of unwavering resolve. For every Masada or Alamo that became a symbol, there are 100 forgotten stands where the stones swallowed the screams and no ballads were sung. Was it worth it? The mothers who lost children, the towns reduced to ash, the cultures erased, their silence lingers in the margins of history. Defiance can inspire, but it can also devastate. That's the duality these fortresses teach us. The same act that etches your name into legend might also erase the future you were fighting to protect. So here's the challenge these ruins leave at our feet. When the impossible stares you down, what do you hold onto? The ingenuity to rewrite the rules, the leadership to light a fire in others, or the wisdom to know when to bend so you don't shatter. The walls always fall in the end, but the echoes of how they fell, that's where the real story lies. So tell me in the comments, what would your last stand look like? And if you found yourself at the breaking point, what would make it worth the cost? Don't forget to subscribe, because history isn't just about the past. It's about the choices we're making right now and the legacies we'll leave when our own sieges are done.